and welcome to our NEC30 webinar, which will be on the Heathrow Express project. Right before we start and look back on the retrospective, that is the first major use of NEC, we'd just like to give it maybe 1 or 2 minutes to allow people to join the webinar. If you have any questions, of course, at any point, or just any sort of, and it doesn't have to be related to the webinar, any tech questions, anything like that can be put into the box that you see on the side of your screen. But yeah, we're just going to give it a few more seconds and let people join. Okay, so yeah, without further ado, I will leave you in the hands of Gren Tipper and Barry Trebes. Thank you.
Thank you, Fine. Welcome everybody to this 1-hour session. We're going to endeavour to go through the slides and reminiscences of the project in 40 minutes, leaving 20 minutes for Q&A. So if you basically store your questions up in the box allocated, and then we'll do our level best to answer your questions. Bearing in mind the project specific ones, it's 30 years almost since the project went through this episode, so therefore we'll do our best between us to answer all questions. But firstly, a bit from me and then Barry on who we are. Right, so I joined BAA in 2009. No, I didn't. I left in 2009. I joined in 1976. And I've worked at Heathrow, Gatwick and Stansted over the years, pinging between the various airports, mainly on major projects. And latterly, before I left from 2004 to 9, I was heading up the infrastructure team, which basically built the airfield infrastructure, runways and taxiways, etc. And BAA, is worth noting, was basically the first client to project manage a large NEC contract. Now, what I should say, because I'm sat here as the project manager, but I also had able support from a chap called Peter Murch and Joey Doran, who were given delegated powers in other sections of the tunnelling works. And I must mention Alan Myers, the project director for Balfour Beatty. Great guy, very professional. And Rod Hall was our MD on the Heathrow Express, and he was quite a colourful character also in terms of actually getting involved with us and basically putting his power into making the contract successful. It's worth mentioning also, I understood this morning that Mark Allen in Australia has managed to keep up till 1 in the morning to join us. So welcome, Mark. Even though you probably sat there in your PJs this morning, but thank you for making the effort. And apologies to any of the Heathrow Express team members participating today but not mentioned. Over to you, Barry.
Thank you for that, Gren. So yeah, so I guess a little bit about me. So I was lucky enough to work on that first project that first major project at Heathrow with a company called Needleman. So Mark, as Gren mentioned, was one of my colleagues and many other colleagues that I've got. And I've been very fortunate really to, over the years, you can see some of the projects there, and there are, to work with so many very good people and companies on those various projects, too many to mention. And really, I think, I'm here kind of, Gren's there representing, I think, really the management style in terms of BAA and the project management. I'm really here kind of representing I suppose the people on the ground, really, what it was like to work with an integrated team on that project, etc. And I think that experience on Heathrow Express is something that will always stay with me, and I still find myself looking at what we did on that project and what was achieved, how we use the NEC contracts. It even made me dig out my original NEC first edition contract to realise that all those core processes that we still use were there right back 30 years ago. And my experience working was also predated by the fact of working on the Stansted Airport development with Gren. Gren was my project manager there, and we're using more traditional contracts, the old ICE, JCT contracts, model form contracts, etc. So and I use it because I do some NEC training. I also use Gren as a bit of an example of a project manager that made decisions. So, which I think is key if you're going to be an NEC project manager. So that's a little bit about me, and it was a catalyst to say for me to help develop the first ever web-based system, to write 1 or 2 books on NEC as well, to share my knowledge, practical knowledge. So I've got a lot to be thankful for, really, from that. So thank you. So if we look at, so if you go back 30 years, NEC now is a brand. If you go back 30 years, back in 1985, they started with a blank sheet of paper at the Institute of Civil Engineers, led by Dr. Martin Barnes. And this idea, could we improve the way that we deliver projects? Could we create a form of contract which would be very management orientated? I think all contracts are the same. They set out the same kind of principles about what a contract needs to do in terms of obligations. BAA were one of those early adopters, so they were using the consultative version. I think I'm right in saying, Gren, I think there was some trialing done at Southampton and learning on that consultative version. So that was a really pioneering thing to have done. And then the first edition came out in 1993. So at the time, I always remember that I think it was Christmas time 92 that I think on the main civils project, I always remember that I think we were 50% of the way measuring traditional bills of quantities on the old ICE conditions of contract when BAA decided that they were going to going to use the new engineering contract. So that was a very bold and different change at that particular point when we were a long way down producing traditional contract documents. That's what I seem to remember. I seem to remember Gren working all over Christmas to try and get the documents ready, because I think we'd had about 2 years of waiting for this project to start. I think each month we had an idea that it was going to start, because I've been involved in some of the cost planning as well early, and effectively we're always, each month we're waiting, and then eventually it went, and then things changed from that point. So yeah, it was but yeah, so it's a new engineering contract. In those days, wasn't the engineering construction contract as it was today. So looking at BAA, I always say that BAA as it was always very, so we're very lucky really as consultants to work with BAA, because they were always looking to improve the way that they did things. And I learned so much really from the way that BAA did things, looking at different ways, developing project management toolkits to manage their projects. Moving on to using it on the Heathrow Express rail link, using NEC and trialing that first NEC contract. You can see in the diagram here that actually I managed to find my first edition. I don't know whether it's worth anything now. First edition, £55 it cost. I see on the box, £55 for that first edition of the NEC engineering and construction contract. But early adopters, pioneers, that's how I certainly see BAA in terms of the way that they really took hold of NEC and decided to try and improve the delivery of their projects.
All right, thank you, Barry. I think it's worth saying actually that when we were leading up to starting the project on site, it was a bit daunting because it was a new contract. We'd never used it before, the team, and therefore, I suppose a degree of nervousness. But once we actually got started, it was the most natural way to manage. Everybody sort of slipped into it quite easily, readily. Right, this is the man of the moment in those days, David Williams. He was adamant about sorting out projects because we were running predominantly over time, over budget, and about 30% of them were in that case. And it was quite revolutionary, David, because he brought construction management to BAA at both Gatwick and at Stansted, long before anybody else did. He embraced design and build where it was appropriate. And interestingly, he gave Mace their first project ever at London Gatwick on one of the piers. So that's where they started. And for me, it was probably the most inspirational director in BAA and probably in the industry. Sadly, he passed away last year, but remarkable guy, true professional.
Yeah, I've got to second that, Gren. I think, you know, in terms, I always say, as a construction director, he was simply the best. I always remember at Stansted, well before Heathrow Express, that you would go to David and explain what was happening on the contract. You give him all the facts, and he would make a decision. And I think, you know, that's something that still holds true now. Good leaders and good managers make decisions. I always try and say that when we do the NEC 4-day accreditation course. You know, you've got to make decisions. You've got to take the facts as you are, and then you've got to make good decisions. And of course, David was also, Gren, he was the first ever NEC user group chairman, of course, as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, a true inspiration, I think. Great guy.
Right, so now on to the actual works itself. So the work began in 1993. That was some enabling works to clear some of the area, and particularly in the central terminal area. It used to be a fuel depot for the airport, and we ended up with about 200 mil of aviation fuel floating on the surface water, on the groundwater, because the geology of Heathrow is basically some brick clay where it remained, and then about 3 meters of gravel, and about halfway down the gravel was the water table. And there was a massive pool of fuel in that area, so there was a major piece of work to actually get into that and suck out the aviation fuel. And also 93 and 92, if that matter, was the trial tunnel as well. So some work on that going on. So 2 tunnels. Sorry, go, Barry.
I was just going to say, obviously, there's that trial tunnel, wasn't there, out at Terminal 4 that we did, you know, well away from all the buildings, I think, at the time, wasn't it? So
yeah.
Because we're also trying out this other new methodology as well on the project, this new Austrian tunnelling method as well. With
the associated fracture grouting, which we all came to love.
Yeah.
So basically, we had 2 6.8 kilometres, 4.2 mile single bore tunnels, including the escape shafts. And we had stations in the central terminal area and Terminal 4. There's a chunk of work being done by Railtrack in the day, which was the electrification of the Great Western Main Line, and they did the flyover junction coming off the main line down towards what was Stockley Park. And going through the Stockley Park area was basically old brickworks where the clay had been nabbed for making bricks, and they'd kindly backfilled it all with domestic refuge, which we were then left to get out and do something with.
Yeah, which was remarkably good condition, I seem to remember, Gren, that you could still read, I think, comic books from the 1960s out of that landfill, I think.
Yeah, I've many a copy of newspapers brought into me showing me what the flavour of the day was.
Yeah.
So this is the route. So in black, diagonal at the top is the Great Western. That's poor quality to read the actual captions, but the route comes down in red, and then the CTA. There's a bit I want to in the central terminal area, just as it emerges from there going south to the curve. I'll come back to this later, but basically there's a junction there which was basically the turning off down to Terminal 4, which is shown, and then there's a stub to enable Terminal 5 to be connected. I'll come back and explain that in a bit more detail later, because it's the important part of one of the areas of risk, because that turnout was actually under the Terminal 3 tax and duty free shop, of all things. But I'll come back to that later. Right, the collapse occurred on the 21st of October, 1994, and I remember vividly being woken from my bed about 12:30 in the morning to be told that there's extensive movement going on. And by the time I got there, the tunnels were evacuated and there were some signs of distress at the surface. The original contract for the tunnels packages, we have to rack our brains on this one, because 30 years ago, trying to remember what the actual original contract sum was. We think it was around about 62 million. And the contract was about 30% complete when the collapse occurred. Interestingly, by the time we actually got a solution to recover it all, that package came out about 150 million in the end. And amazingly, we managed to actually open the Heathrow Express operationally only 6 months late. One of the things about the program was, because we were the 6 months late bit came from the business. They wanted it no later than 6 months, and then that got everybody thinking, well, that's impossible, you know, given the extent of the scope change and da-da-da-da-da. And then we adopted this principle in that we can do it only 6 months late if, and basically it made us pose what the ifs were, and a lot of the ifs were faced back at the business. So yeah, if we can have possession of that BAA, we can do it. Yeah. If you can do this for a BAA, we can do it. There's a lot of ifs, and it's also extended to Balfour BT and to the designers. But every time, as soon as we thought we can't do that date, then you say, why? Because of this. So, well, if that was correct, could we do it? Yes. And that's how we got through it.
Yeah, so you can see that. So you can see a picture there. So Mark's who's on the call. He'll recognise our office there. We can see those cabins next to that kind of staircase that are leaning downwards there. So that's how close we were, and you can see there's some photographs into the central area where obviously the tunnel collapsed and the movement had started to happen in terms of the project. So that's the central terminal area next to the fuel farm as well. The old fuel farm that was in there, so you can see the extent to the movement, can't you? You can see there, and obviously you can see in the bottom right hand corner there, you can see the Balfour BT cabins there also kind of sinking down as well. So and you can see, you know, the kind of major disruption that the tunnel collapse was having on the delivery of the project. So it's a bit of a monumental moment, I think, Gren, isn't it? I mean, Gren kind of, remembers vividly being woken up at 12:30 a.m. with that. I seem to remember coming into the airport. I think it was a bit later. I think it was probably about 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning when we were on our way into the airport to hear that there was a problem at Heathrow. I think, initially I kind of thought that because there was a bit of an incident, I think, at Terminal 4, probably, I don't know, a couple of months prior to that, with a possible terrorist attack. So, you kind of initially thought that maybe it's something to do with that. Then obviously, as the day wore on, but it was certainly, I think we make light, kind of maybe you look back at it, but it was certainly a life-defining moment, Gren, wasn't it? I think that whole thing, the catalyst of what happened after that point to recover it. No, it's amazing.
Certainly was, and the incident at Terminal 4 was the IRA lobbing mortars over from a car park onto the apron. The fire service actually beat me to the airport that morning, and bless them, they managed to actually park over the area that was basically collapsing. So we quickly moved them to the side out of the way. And once we'd established that nobody was down there and nobody was injured, then basically they gave because effectively the London Fire basically take over the area initially until they understand what they've got. and an excellent fire chief, and basically soon grasped that there's nothing for them to do, and therefore they departed. The next slide shows the area affected. So you can see where the major collapse points were. So the bits in dark blue were where the tunnels themselves actually collapsed. And when I say collapse, what happened was the invert came up into the tunnel, so it sort of folded in. So that's where the major depressions were in those dark blue areas. But the settlement spread far wider than that, and you can see to the north of it was about 200 mils, 8 inches deep, that far away.
Yeah, and I certainly always remember the emergency work to actually stabilise the tunnels, because the tunnels went under, I think, correct to say, went under the LUL, London Underground, London Underground, and also under the station box. And I always remember, so there was some prompt action to drill from the surface down to the tunnels and fill them. I recall it was about 20,000 cube of, I think grade 60 or grade 80 concrete was pumped into the top, covering everything. So there was machines, there were welding bottles, all sorts of stuff was left down in those tunnels, all covered in that. And I just vividly remember as well the contractor coming in with literally carrier bags full of concrete tickets, from Tesco's and things like that, just come in. Bizarrely, we even had people on spec turning up with loads of concrete, I seem to remember, because I think basically we were taking all of the concrete from all the surrounding areas. So I think at the time lots of projects weren't too happy with us because of the demand we had to try and stabilise and rescue the situation. I certainly remember that. I can remember these carrier bags coming in with just concrete tickets, loads of them.
It was much the annoyance of other projects in London. It was actually foamed concrete we used to fill. So we went for strength was strong enough to hold up, but something we could actually take out again without dynamite, which is what we did. Not dynamite, I mean. Just before we pass on, actually, to the right-hand side, that red section there is basically where we did the fracture grouting from. So there's a number of shafts, particularly in the CTA in Terminal 4, where we did fracture grouting, which was used to compensate for the ground settlement, to make sure the ground, didn't move downwards too much, within permitted parameters. But that's getting a bit too technical.
But I think it's right in saying, Gren, wasn't it, that I think actually the configuration of the tunnels was quite unique as well. I'm not sure that the tunnel diameters weren't, I think, particularly an issue, but I think having 3 tunnels, the kind of together in a, and I can't remember what the zone was, about 50 meters or something like that, was something I'm not sure had ever been done anywhere else in the world. I don't think at that particular point.
It added to the dynamics of the way settlement occurred and how loads were actually transferred onto the tunnels. And if you have that combination, and with fracture grouting, with the forces involved with that, that wasn't the cause of the incident. There's a lot to do with the workmanship. In fact, all to do with the workmanship of and the importance of getting it right in every detail. Yeah.
And I think that was the thing as well, wasn't it? Because there was a lot of settlement monitoring going on. There'd been a lot of settlement monitoring going on before any of the incident had happened. So there was a lot of care being gone into in terms of checking what was happening, whether movement was happening, and all those type of things. And as Gren said, I can't remember. I'm not a technical, but to me it was very simple. That idea that the invert was failing. It was like a big zit. Once it failed in one point, but it travelled all the way down. And I always seem to remember, I think when there was some cores taken, I think from memory, I think that there should have been a concrete invert of about 300 mil. And in some locations, I think it was only like 25 or 50 millimeters of concrete, because people were on a bonus. And, you've got in those dusty environments, then, it's very crude, I think, how measuring how deep it was in terms of having a bit of rebar sticking out of the invert. And it's very easy for somebody just to push that rebar in to give the illusion that the depth of concrete had been achieved. So it's a very dangerous place.
the weak areas, it wasn't the actual invert, it was the weak areas were the intersections, because the NATM is built in sections. It was the cleanliness of cleaning out on the junctions between the two. That's where that sort of example was found. But that's where the problem was. It didn't have the integrity of the junctions between.
Yeah. Right, so going back, so 1990, I came across it, 15th of May 1997. Look, I came across this when we're doing kind of reminiscing about the project in terms of Heathrow Express, and obviously that idea of the design and construction of the Heathrow Express route. And actually, you can see it, we had there, Gren's mentioned Alan Myers, who was the Balfour Beatty project manager, explained how the project was revived after serious tunnel collapse on the 21st of October 94. And described the various sections of the contract. Gren there briefly reviewed the project and explained how the British Airports Authority formed and managed the formation of this important thing to resolve the problems that occurred as a result of the collapse. And if this idea of, a single, a single team approach, well, I think is part of what was, enabled the project to recover. I think the idea of all those companies working together, and of course it changed the name. We don't use new Austrian tunnel method anymore. Now it's called spray concrete lining. So the project had one or two other influences on it, but this whole idea of having that single team, and so again, that was my first experience of, I was used on other projects where we would play table tennis, we sit in our own cabins, whereas here we were working together with in all the, whether it be design or commercial. We're working together to actually recover the and what a learning point that was. It just shows you and actually how much more efficient and effective it is to work in an integrated team, and how much more you can learn as well, because for the first time you sat there working with a contractor, and we were doing quotations from the client's team with the contractor, and they were doing their own quota, and then we'd sit down and we'd compare notes, or we'd be working together, we'd discuss the quotations and the changes. And I think that really was a very different way. And I certainly know after Heathrow Express, trying to use that approach maybe on other projects when we left Heathrow, maybe people probably weren't still ready for that. Whereas now, obviously, we come forward 30 years, everybody talks about collaboration, working together. So it was a huge learning point. And I think something I just remember this morning, that we had a lovely lady called Fiona Hammond who was the legal advisor for BAA, and I always remember we had one meeting with her, and she said, well, basically we can either kind of go to war, or which could take us 10 years to go through the courts to solve this problem, or we need to find some other way. So I think that was interesting as well, in terms of an operational business. I think that's the thing that I always took from it as well, working BAA as an operational business. The fact you couldn't have your airport closed for 10 years, could you? I mean, that ruins your business. So finding a way forward, I think, in this whole idea, this single team, I think is actually something that was really, critical to it all, I think. So do you remember giving that talk, Gren?
Indeed. I spent ages getting prepared for it. We better move on, Barry, because we've got
yeah, no problem. Yeah, good. So NEC, obviously, I always remember that Sir Alan Muir-Wood, who was one of the world's leading tunnelling experts, also a past president of the Institute of Civil Engineers, was very critical of NEC, kind of blaming it for the collapse at the time. Maybe if we'd used a more traditional form of contract. I'm not really sure that's, I don't personally think that's kind of true. What I do know is that, through the managements of NEC, I think the features of the contract, we knew, before the collapse, we knew where we were, because we were using compensation events, we were keeping on top of the program. I think we were far more informed about where we were than we probably would have been on a traditional if the same thing had happened. So, but it's interesting that, NEC had this, and you can see there was an avalanche of defence. I saw a little article in the New Civil Engineer of the NEC contract, and I think certainly that put us into a better position to recover the situation than we would have been maybe on using more traditional forms of contract.
Right. Barry's covered a bit part of this, the previous slides, BAA were very clear that the operational business always comes first for them. So we had to find a way forward. We couldn't wait for any type of delay to do with going through the courts or falling out with the main contractor. And Sir John Egan was inspirational, actually, because he put blame completely to one side, met Balfour Beatty at the highest level, and paved the way, the foundations to actually for us to get it together. Interestingly, this was the first project BAA where they're taking out an insurance policy for the project, and the insurance did not cover the whole loss substantially. Quite a bit, in fact, was not covered. We had a massive cofferdam built to actually recover the big area where the collapse was, and that gave BAA some opportunities. And effectively, the single team approach really started on the day of the collapse. When we look back, what we agreed early on, after we got the tunnels under control, was that Sir John Egan said, the way we deal with this is if we actually enter into a relationship where we both, it's win-win for both. And so what was agreed was that any money not recovered from the insurance and anything which was deemed to be increased scope for Heathrow to take advantage of from the space created would be picked up by BA. That bit would, but basically anything outside of that, then the two parties would share in that, and that probably gives one of the best recipes, if you like, to collaborate fully. I've put this slide in mainly just to show the complexity, if you like, of the organisation. But I'm not going to go through it in any detail. But we did have a single team before the collapse, and that was in that box, which is under the BA client, where the project team, Mott McDonald and Taylor Woodrow, because Taylor Woodrow were originally the construction managers. Basically, we formed a single team and shared resource and put the best people where we could to take it forward. And we had Mott McDonald wearing two hats, one back to the client and one into the actual Heathrow Express team. After the collapse, we went into a very simple solution of a team layout. It was basically, there was the delivery project manager, which was Alan Myers, there was the project director for Balfour Beatty, and the client project manager, which is myself and my colleagues managing the various areas, which is Peter and Jerry again. So the delivery teams, the single commercial teams, and the single design team, we all worked in unison. We had a design, construction and management plan for every piece of the work, which we jointly put together, and we executed on that basis.
I think what's interesting, Gren, for me, looking at it, reflecting on that now, is that how, all the different organisations then did work together. And I think, it obviously came from the leadership at the top that we're in this together, we need to work together. And, it was the fact that, you sometimes say, don't you, in these integrated teams, that you kind of put your kind of company hat or your company kind of logo to one side, and you just focus on delivering the project. But I mean, going back, I'm kind of thinking, well, how was that quite done? I'm not sure quite. I guess part of it was because the messaging that was coming down was, no, it's a single team, we've got to work together to recover and everybody just focused on that rather than trying to find blame or cast blame on each other. So it was interesting, I think, how that was, how was that achieved, really. So the role in the recovery. So even before we had the tunnel collapse, so Martin Barnes, obviously this was the first big NEC contract. So Martin Barnes was very active in coming to talk to BAA, come and talk to people who were putting the contracts together at the time. And I always remember it was very complimentary about the way that the contracts were being operated. It certainly was, there was no hiding place. You needed to make sure you had good document management and good communications going on. The need, obviously, to make sure, because we had, 2 or 3, well, we had 3 work sites, I think. So the idea to get consistency amongst the teams in terms of how they were approaching using the NEC contract. So we had consistency down at T4, Central Terminal area, and the running tunnels at Shepperton Lane, etc. So we had all of that going on. So he kept in close contact, and that was really useful. And obviously, once we had the collapse, he then came involved again and gave us some very sage advice on various aspects of the contract as well. So I think, and I do think that because we were on top of things, and it was hard, because I think in the first 9 months, I always say to people, I think we had something like 2,000 communications, whether that be early warnings and notifications of compensation events or compensation events. So there was a lot of communication going on, but we were endeavouring always to try and keep on top of the programme, keep on top of change. And it was a lot of hard work, actually. I remember a lot of people put in, even before we had the tunnel collapse, a lot of hard work was going in to manage the contract, and tried to do it in the way that, Martin Barnes and that team that had written the contract wanted it to work under the contract.
Right, onto the learning bit, which you'll all be interested in. I think it's fair to say we didn't really truly understand the risk involved, and I'll come back to that on the next slide. And although we executed the contract in the spirit of the NEC, what really showed us what collaboration looked like and partnering was on the back of we were actually sharing the financial loss. So we were motivated to work together very, very in a special way. And some of the best learning you can get from that is not likely to be incurred again, as a solution in that way. But the closer you can get on the pain and gain share, where you're both equally motivated to get it right and work together, then the better end result. No two ways about it. So just the night of the collapse itself got us basically close together. In 3 days that followed, the tunnels were still collapsing, so therefore we decided to bore down into the tunnels in, I think it was 3-4 places, and we injected foam concrete to basically arrest the any further subsidence and collapse of the tunnels. Interestingly, with the project manager, with myself and Alan Myers, we had interconnecting offices, doors were always open, and we basically did our day-to-day interaction on bits of paper called records of discussion, RODs. And it was handwritten, so basically, what is the problem, one column, what is the answer in the right? And sometimes it was so quick moving where we had to basically agree at a plan of action there and then and execute it, and commercially we had to catch up. In other areas where I had more time to think about it, the commercial teams basically got their heads together and worked through the ins and outs of it to make sure that it was the optimum solution. But basically, everything we did from the collapse onwards was recorded on records of discussion, and that was effectively the instruction we worked upon. So we were a single team. It was all together. Designers included, and the client was very much in the team, leading from the front, and we had to be for that very reason.
And I think that flowed down, Gren, didn't it? I think the whole idea of that working together flowed down from that example, really. If the people were above us in the senior management teams were working together, and that flowed down, that kind of gave us the behaviours that we were expected then to utilise when we were working together to try and deal with sorting out the programme or the costs and all those type of things. Just flowed down, isn't it? But it's just interesting how when you look back, you kind of think how did we achieve that? And I think it was, I'm sure there was a plan, wasn't there, to do that. But it just seemed to, almost from now I look back, it just seemed to happen, didn't it? But maybe that was because of the people's behaviours. We had
the right set of behaviours. I mean, one thing worth stating and stressing is the importance of getting things right from the outset, and putting the effort into that, because getting it wrong, it impacts on your family life. It scars you to a degree, actually. I mean, we all felt that, because although there's a lot of finger points at the time, if we all analyse what went on throughout, then we all contributed to some degree. I can still vividly remember now. I used to have a fax machine. Those who have ever used the fax machine, probably a lot of you haven't, but there's a fax machine by my bed for about 6 months, getting tunneling results in when we were doing the recovery to make sure we weren't exceeding the permitted levels of depression on the surface, and also what the actual lining of the tunnels were doing. And another bit of learning really is if you ever go into a project that has been through the mill, whether it's basically injury, time related or money related, then be considerate to those that have been through it, because it is traumatic for everybody. I said I'd come back to risk. The slide there is a photograph of, right, this is the apron at Terminal 3. The original design, because in the ground there, that egg-shaped piece is the tunnel below. This is to scale, and that originally was going to be under Terminal 3's tax and duty-free shop. So notwithstanding the fact it couldn't be closed for operational reasons, and if it was put out of action, that was about 10% of BAA's income at Heathrow, so significant. And when we come to actually look again at the risks prevailing and how best to mitigate them before we started again, we found that we could and we should move that turnout further south under the apron to Terminal 3, out of the way of the building. So all we had to do was basically redesign that piece, close the apron for the period we're actually working in the area, and basically job done. But it's just a graphical example of being told you've got this new Austrian tunneling method and you can use fracture grouting and all will be okay, when you could actually put it in a place where you could be need less critical to your nervous system and the business that's actually looking onto you. Over to you, Barry.
So in terms of, I guess looking at the benefits of the NEC, so that I think you can tell from this, there's so many factors, all the good people and companies that work together, all the good ideas. But I think certainly from a kind of management and contract point of view, I think the NEC certainly provided an effective tool, I think, with good management processes within it to help us. So I think we were already, because of what had been done before the collapse, I think we were in a good situation to understand where we were. And I think then moving away from that with a lot of hard work with many people to then get the new contracts in place, to have that that single team, that different way of working together. And of course, really, when you look at NEC, I always kind of think now that NEC is driving you towards that anyway. It's the idea that you talk to each other, you work together, you discuss things, you consult with each other. And as Gren said, maybe that's taking it to the absolute limits in terms of Gren having a fax machine. And some of the younger members who are joining here may not even remember what a fax machine is. But certainly that importance of making informed decisions. I was saying the train, making informed decisions with the best information you've got. And do you know what? It might not. I mean, like Gren's mentioned, doing those rods, there's instant, having to make instant snap decisions on maybe the most basic of information. But in order to keep moving forward, to keep the project going, those kind of things needed to be done. And I think, I think there was, to me, so much learning about what a good project manager has to do in terms of making decisions on the best informed, and that's what I see the contract. I've never seen though I'm a QS commercial person by background, contracts person, the contract's there to support the delivery of project, to support a PM, giving them information and data in real time about what's happening so they can make informed decisions overall about what they need to do under the contract. And I think, and also reinforce that idea that those right behaviours. You can either make these contracts very hard for yourself by being in your own cabins and just firing bits of paper to and from each other, maybe hiding behind web-based systems to do it, or you sit down and discuss. And it's amazing if you just take the time to sit down and discuss things, then it is a lot more efficient and effective. You may think you haven't got time to do it, but actually you haven't got time not to do it, to be honest with you. So sitting down, discussing those things, and certainly that integrated team, real eye opener, to see the world from the perspective of the contractor, as well as seeing it from the client side, and the value of having those discussions about finding the right way forward. So I think that gets us to the end of our formal slides, doesn't it, Gren? So I don't know if we've got any queries or questions from anybody.
Yeah, thanks for that, both Gren and Barry. That was really interesting stuff. Yeah, so if anyone does have any questions, please put that through to the question box. So yeah, we're just waiting for them to come through. If anyone has any questions.
I think while we are just waiting, and I have to say that I think, Gren, you kind of touched on it briefly, but I think, on a personal perspective, that was quite a traumatic time, really, wasn't it? In terms of the project and being, under intense scrutiny. We obviously, as I said, I think I was talking to Gren earlier, I was saying that I always remember being interviewed by the HSC about the project, and I think Gren, I think you well, obviously all the management team were interviewed by the HSC, weren't they, for their to ask questions about the project.
Yeah, I was singled out to be asked questions under caution, so I had the privilege of having a lawyer beside me to support me if I needed it, which I didn't need. But yeah, basically, you just the one thing that is difficult about these situations is the number of people that criticise or question you with the benefit of hindsight. The construction industry would benefit greatly by a PhD course in hindsight for us all, because we'd never have any problems ever again. Yeah, it is painful. I wouldn't wish that type of thing on anybody. And unfortunately, nobody was injured or killed, which is the most important thing. Yeah, it was all down to time and money at the end of the day. There's people feeling bruised about it, which is not a bad outcome when you consider what could have been the case.
Yeah, and of course now we kind of talk about, don't we, the kind of, I mean, I think this is a point, I'd make on two levels. I mean, one level I always say about NEC, there is no hiding point. It's very demanding. If you've got lots of change going on, I remember even before the collapse, we were working long hours to try and keep on top of things. And I guess, for you, Gren, it was the same, wasn't it? That, it was something I don't think we never talked about, going back 30 years, we never talked about mental health, did we? Or the strain and stresses. And I think you touched on it, recognizing the stresses and strains it does have on people when you're in such situations, that trying to recover a project.
Yeah, you've always got to try and remember. It's easy to forget to try and put yourselves in their shoes when you're interacting with them. That applies within your own team and also for people on the outside looking in. Yeah, it's always difficult to remember. I think I have to correct myself after that, because obviously I was managing projects for another 15 years after that. So major projects. So you have to question yourself when things do go wrong. Just basically put yourself down a bit and think, think about them, what the situation that existed at the time, how they responded to it, because you can only act on what you know at the end of the day.
Yeah.
We do have some questions that have come in, but before that, there is a message here from someone who I'm sure you both be able to find out who it is. But yeah, Gren, Barry, wonderful to hear you both and see you both this morning. You brought back some great memories, and despite it heading towards 2 a.m., kept me very awake.
I can guess who that is. Hello, Mark.
Yeah, the NEC ECC has a very slow take up here in Australia, but we are taking small steps through more collaborative forms of contracts, like incentivized target cost contracts. I'm a big supporter of the NEC ECC and look forward to using it here before I retire. Thanks, you both.
Cheers,
Well,
Mark.
both myself and Barry are willing to go to Australia to assist. All expenses paid.
Yeah, so I'm just going through some questions here. Post-project, was there any consideration of other contract forms, or were you quickly confident that NEC would be the best for future projects?
We did a lot of soul searching on all fronts, to be honest. And in fairness, the contract itself never came up. It was more about how we should be structured as a team, because we did have some criticisms from some quarters, even within my own organisation, about having it as a single team means that you're, as a business, you're basically equally in the firing line when things go wrong. But I, for one, stuck to my guns. I said the only way you can get this recovered is basically make it even bigger single team, so we're all in it together, and that's what we did. But the contract itself was never, I can never remember being questioned as being either responsible or detracting from the collaboration, etc. So everything to me from the NEC was positive.
Yeah, I don't think there was. I mean, to me, it was the opposite. I think using the NEC, as I say, if you'd gone to any other form of contract, if you'd gone to FIDIC or ICE, would we have had the information and knowledge about where we were contractually with the program? Because none of those other contracts had those key management features. So I don't recall. And I'm obviously lower down the chain at the time. I don't recall there being any discussion about using a different form of contract. I think the contract was working well. We were trying to use it as well as we could. And I think this is the great. I think I come back to that theme that making informed decision. And Gren just touched on something I think before as well, that Gren as a project manager and David H. Williams, I always say that they were two of the best people I ever worked with. And the reason for when I look back at that is that they would support your decisions, because you can only make decisions with the best information you've got at the time. And do you know what I always say in the training course? An hour later, a day later, a week later, a month later, that decision may not be optimal. But the thing is that was great about Gren and David Williams was that they would support you. And I don't know, they just seemed to know that you had made or giving the best advice on the best information you had. And I think that's where the NEC helped. I think that we had, because of that management information, we were able to make those better informed decisions, I think.
There's one person I forgot to mention actually during the presentation. That's Chris Rusty, because he was brought in from being the engineering director for Heathrow to become the Heathrow Express project director. And again, in terms of collaborating and partnering, he was spot on. He was very influential in making sure we did actually sustain that partnering ethos.
Yeah.
We have quite a few other questions now pouring in. But yeah, what was the project insurance policy, and how did this sit alongside the contractor's insurance?
It was, I can't remember the details now, but basically BAA took out a project insurance, and that was reflected in the insurance the contractor took out. Can you recall, Barry, the actual?
Well, I think on top of that, there was also, I don't think it got fully in place, but I seem to remember there was something unusual. There was also a business interruption insurance that was going in place as well, because obviously I think there's a recognition by the airport itself as an operational business that there could be an impact if something went wrong. And actually, I think it was. We always say, wasn't it the biggest civil engineering insurance claim in the 20th century? I think.
I know it was big, and I think we always used to do the business interruption stuff, but this one was actually it was wider. It was about the project as well. So that did mean the other parties to the contract needed less cover, if you like.
Yeah.
I can't remember the details, to be honest, though. Exact
Yeah,
details.
but it's things like, so covering things like, an excavator running into a jumbo jet type of thing. So the insurance policy was a lot higher than previously, and was that something better that the client would take? And I think you see that on big projects now, like CTRL, etc. Maybe kind of Network Rail and people like that, which will then do that, won't they? Because they recognise that that policy needs to be in place, and passing it down the chain isn't maybe the most effective way of making sure those policies are in place.
We also have here, it was mentioned that some industry experts blamed the use of NEC for the tunnel collapse. What were these arguments cited by those experts? And do you think those points were valid in hindsight?
Well, I think the chief one there was Sir Alan Morewood, who I think obviously he's a world expert in tunnelling work, and I think his feeling was that maybe that if a more traditional form of contract, I think the emphasis was it's a new contract, it hasn't been really used before, maybe people didn't know what they were doing, etc. But I don't think that NEC really, yes, NEC had different language and terminology and things, but I don't think in terms of the way that we organised and did things, having been on previous projects, did it really, I don't think it revolutionised the way that we organised ourselves. It certainly revolutionised the idea that we manage the contracts, I think. The detail.
So I think some of it was about threat to other forms of contract. So it was born out of that as well. Why do you need yet another form of contract?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Someone here also says, I remember the incident well, as I was a tunnel engineer at the time. What was the method of reconstruction? Was it still SCL?
So we had SCI, didn't we?
It was part and part. There were certain areas where we needed to use the shotcrete because of the shape and nature of it, but part of the recovery through the CTA, we used larger diameter tunnels because that was the only way we could get in there safely and take out the collapsed sections of tunnel and the foam concrete within it. But certain areas we still needed to do shotcrete, and that turned out under the apron of Terminal 3 was a good example of it. You couldn't do it any other way.
Yeah. In fact, because we went back to traditional tunnelling techniques, didn't we? Really, where you kind of hand plate. If you look at London Underground and you see all the what they call the SGI tunnels, all the the metal kind of components that are all joined together in a big. So obviously, in certain areas, that's what it was. It was almost kind of hand excavating out really to break out things, because there were things like some of the equipment were buried, like the big hydrema trucks down there and the gas bottles and all that type of stuff. So yeah, it was a combination, wasn't it? I think, as you said, Gren, wasn't it? Certainly the CTA, where we had all that foam concrete, there was quite a lot of effort there going in just to do that, all that handwork of lifting all those things.
Courses, and we were better equipped to use shotcrete the second time around as well.
Yeah. We still have a few more questions, but I think there's only just probably time for just one last one. Contractors are often smaller than the client, and as a result might lack the capacity to manage and administer the contract as effectively. Are there any actions from your experience that clients can consider to help ease administration for contractors and make sure they feel confident about using NEC, which might be a much more active and collaborative way of working compared to historical industry norms?
I can answer that from a project manager's view, but obviously Barry will have a commercial view on it as well. I think on the smaller ones, particularly where you've got multiple projects, if you like, so it's one big project where you've got it broken down into phases or to sections, then the best way to attack it, if you're looking at contractors who are not familiar with it, is basically to support them in training of it and to and guide them as well when you're actually on the site, because you're not there as a client trying to rob them or do them down. You want them to administer the contract correctly gives you timely information so you can respond to it. So you've got to be, from a client's perspective, you've got to be hands-on and supportive, and it works. One of the problems with the NEC, if you haven't used it before, is the fear of the unknown.
Yeah, I support that, Graham. I think effectively it is about, isn't it? No, you want to be successful, and if you've got a supply chain who's coming new to NEC, they're obviously going to be a little bit reticent about it, knowing which notifications to give at what time, etc. And so, ensuring that you can help them to understand why it's important to you. I think as a client, why is it important to you? And again, that was the big thing I think for. Now I look back with BAA, was I always remember John Fenton, who was I think maybe he was head of commercial at the time, saying, well, 30% of our projects overrun on time and budget. We need a better way of controlling it. And that's really what NEC was brought in to do, was to try and help businesses have that greater certainty of outcome on their projects by having more predictability. But in order to do that, of course, the information, you need to gather that information from your supply chain. And obviously, web-based systems, as I say, from the back of that, we helped to develop the first ever web-based system for NEC contracts. You see them all there now. But it is also, trying to help the supply chain. I think it's right, help the supply chain. And sometimes I think making sure we use the appropriate NEC contract, because I think sometimes people use the full-blown engineering construction contract when maybe the short contract could be used, something a bit simpler, perhaps. So I think sometimes we use contracts that, if you use a full contract, they're very demanding in terms of the management, whereas the short contracts by design are meant to be slightly simpler. So I think that's an area. I certainly know that the contract board from NEC feel that perhaps we don't use the short contracts as much as we should do. And emphasising Gren, I don't want anybody to fail managing the contract. It's far better that somebody is managing it as properly as they can, because it gives you good information to enable you to try and hopefully get a successful outcome.
Thank you. Yeah, the other handful of questions, we will see if we can answer those at a later date and sort of distribute to everyone who's attended. Just a few things before we do go. Just be sure to download the community app if anyone hasn't done so already, because hopefully we will be continuing discussions about all things NEC within the app, and also trying to promote certain activities. So you'll be the first to know about certain events, webinars, etc. that will be happening. And also you'll get access to our exclusive podcast. We also have the new course, the Blended PMA, which is a mixture of virtual and tutor-led modules. So if anyone is looking to get that project manager accreditation and feel like this format might suit their needs better, then please do check that out on our website. And finally, our annual conference and awards are coming up this year on the 13th of July. Again, if you'd like to know more about that, so when we do announce things like the agenda, the speakers, etc., all of that information will be out on the app first. So if you do want to download that app, and yeah, you can book your place now, just heading to that link. I'd like to give a big thanks to Gren and Barry for that trip down memory lane. That was a very interesting webinar, and I hope that those attending have also found it useful. So yeah, thanks both, and thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah, thank you everyone.
Thank you.